Hey everyone, Curse Deck Builder here, making our way to 10,000 decks assisted, and here we are with Hope Estheim, is what I'm going to say, a white-blue Lifegain deck. I'm sorry I have lost my voice a little bit over the weekend, lots of celebrations happened, and so I'm going to sound like this for today. I hope everyone else had a wonderful weekend as well. This is a deck that comes to us from Shirok. Shirok is looking at this deck mainly for some cuts, mainly for, because we're at 111 cards, but also kind of looking at what our alternative win cons are, and if we should be leaning towards a little more mill or a little more life gain as options, which are good questions because when a deck is so reliant on their commander like this, it does create this kind of situation where it can be difficult to figure out what we're going to do should our commander evaporate or get hated out of the game. Likewise, there is something to be said about how milling and life gain are strategies that do need a little more oomph, but let's get into that after we take a look at it. So thank you for joining me, and let's get right into it. If you'd like to take a look at the deck list we're talking about today, or if you'd like to submit your own deck list to me so that I can make a video assisting your deck, please check the video description down below. So who is Hope Estheim and why are they our mill and life gain commander? Well, this one's actually pretty straightforward. For 2 mana for a 2/2 human wizard in white-blue colors, they have 2 abilities, lifelink, and the main one, at the beginning of your end step, each opponent mills X cards, where X is the amount of life you gain this turn. Very, very simple, and you get the entire idea of the deck right away, right? We want a situation where we are milling our opponents out based off of the life that we've gained on our turn. I would say there's generally like 2 directions to take a deck like that. Direction 1 would be to build it as a how would I put this? To build this as a long-term kind of deck, which I believe this is the current build. You know, what we do is we take out our commander and we're hoping to mill, 8 cards, 12 cards, another 12 cards. Like we're trying to take our opponent's decks out in chunks, and ideally around, probably turn 7, 8, we're threatening to completely mill them out. There are other ways of doing this. I will say that the other way would be to mill all our opponents at once. This could be setting up infinite life gain combos or combinations of cards that can easily gain you 100 or more health, casting your commander and ending your turn. A great way of doing this would be like casting something like Silence first, basically holding out the fact that your opponents mostly can no longer interact with you, doing your combo, milling them all out. However, one of the requests for this was to keep it bracket 3, and fundamentally that is a different deck than the one we're looking at. I do like that deck a little more, I won't lie, because of the type of decks I like to play, but I think this is a great deck to build at this kind of like chunking our opponents with mill and life gain. Like, I think this is perfect. However, looking at the deck, we have to address, before we go into our regular checks, is this kind of tension that the deck cannot escape. I think we've talked about this recently, but there is this problem that certain strategies and certain ideas kind of have ceilings to them if we're not leaning into, tutors, fast mana, things like that. Like EDH, milling all your opponents out is a very feasible thing, but here, when we're not trying to use an infinite combo or a million storm triggers, it gets a little trickier. Life gain and I'm going to say mill are both strategies that they don't tend to pressure our opponents in the traditional way, right? One of the things that if you were doing like a group slug, or if you're doing let's say a generic +1/+1 counter deck, we set ourselves up to pressure our opponent's life total in meaningful ways that magnifies damage they might be taking from other opponents, from their own cards, from the kind of attacks and blocks they're going to do, right? If you're threatening quite a bit of damage, your opponents have to be a little more frugal with the kind of attacks they're going to make, just in case they need to do blocks, right? However, things like mill don't really have a comparison to that, because outside of dedicated graveyard decks that will do a lot of self-mill, most decks really won't care when you mill the first 40 cards. Don't get me wrong, Players, especially newer players, might have those feel bads where they see all their best cards in the graveyard, and that sucks. But realistically, the majority of your deck that is milled, you were never going to draw into anyways, and therefore it's kind of meaninglessly gone. It's only when that last card is gone do you get into that situation where you're like, oh no, I've lost the game, right? Which makes it so that while you're milling your opponents, well, generally they're not thinking too much about the attacks they might be susceptible to, or the damage they might take from another player, or, I mean, seriously, the infect counters or the poison counters they might be getting somewhere else, right? It's just like a different lane, and you don't play well with others, so it's kind of hard to roll that boulder up there. Likewise with Lifegain, Lifegain is a strategy that is very dependent on working with a small number of cards that benefit for life game triggers or benefit from the sheer volume of life you have, one of which will be in our additions. But that also has the same kind of problem, is that most opponents don't care if you have 200 life or you have 500 life. Don't get me wrong, as someone who's played a extreme life gain deck, when you have 1 billion life, they care. But anything before that, most opponents will kind of shrug their shoulders and go, we'll get there. It's going to be a bit, but we'll get there. So combining these two ideas does stress out the deck a little bit, because it forces us to play cards that don't play well in both scenarios. Like, for example, a great example would be like Ruin Crab. Ruin Crab only works towards the mill plan and does absolutely nothing towards the life gain plan, outside of being a creature that enters the battlefield. And that makes this card kind of stressful to have, or it kind of stresses the deck to have a card like this, because it only helps half of it. But then you just get a bunch of cards that can effectively just do nothing, you know, where, like, for example, Beacon of Immortality doubles your life total, which is really, really cool. But if you just don't have your commander or a means to take advantage of it, it's really not doing much for you. It's not affecting your opponent's boards, it's not affecting strategies, really. You're just buying yourself time. It might as well be a fog, and we'll get back to fogs. So, with this in mind, I feel like inevitably we need to be pretty critical of the cards in the deck, right? When a lot of our cards do not have an inherent power by themselves, we need to be critical. Let's say that again. But with that in mind, let's take a look at the things we always take a look at, which is lands, curve, mana rocks, and colors. So lands, we're at 36 lands. I think this is a bit, I would at least say 37. I'd be down to go to 38. You can see we have several, like 5 mana, we've got actually quite a bit of 5 mana cards. We've got 6 mana cards, we've got 7 mana cards, and we do actually want to cast these cards. So being able to hit 37 lands is probably the best here. I just think it's very, very meaningful in a deck that kind of somewhat struggles to draw cards. It definitely draws cards, but it doesn't do it as straightforwardly as we would hope in a blue deck. So I think we are very much so benefiting from an extra land. Looking at the curve, this is undoubtedly the part of the deck that's the roughest, right? Where we have huge kind of like bump at the 4 mana slot, where we have lots and lots of cards that all kind of, I don't know, they do very similar things, and they don't really give us a lot to work with. So we've got this kind of zone where not the best cards exist, and we kind of have to get through that bump. After that, our curve does continue. As I said before, we've got 6, 8, so we got like 7, no, that's more. We've got 8 cards in our 5 drops. We've got 4 cards in our 6 drops, and then 2 cards in the 7 drop. I don't mind necessarily 2 cards, but we are going to talk about these higher mana cards, as we do have 11 cards to cut. Looking at colors, I will say we do have that kind of strange balance again, where almost half of our deck is white, but our white mana production is only 64% of our deck. This, once again, is probably due to the fact that the very large amount of islands that we have, coupled potentially with a few colorless lands, as we see here, that make it harder and harder for white production. Whereas on the other hand, we have 35% of the deck requires blue, and 53% of the deck lands produce blue. I know this is something that, like, maybe I shouldn't say it. I feel as if this is something people don't think about too much when building decks, but I would recommend this is something to pay attention to. I get that it's kind of hard to visualize. It's not the same thing as like laying out a curve, but I mean, these numbers do exist in Moxfield, and I find them to be. Generally, it is worth considering that I would like white mana to be at least 70%. And I think keeping blue mana, maybe get that to like 55 and you'll be fine. However, the deck is so reliant on white mana to do a lot of the things it wants to do that I'm very heavily invested in increasing our. Likewise, very quickly looking at our mana rocks, we have quite a few. We have the Water and Wind Crystal, which uniquely are very good in this deck, so even without their mana reduction capabilities, they're really, really cool. But we still have cards like Mind Stone that just feel particularly weak for something like this. Cosmos Elixir is also kind of stressful for what it does, but, you know, fine cards. I just really think at least the colorless producing mana rocks can be really good. Keep Soul Ring, keep Arcane Signet. Talisman of Progress I think is fine here, and cut whatever's left. Okay, so really quickly, I want to go over the kind of cards that catch my eye that I do move. And the way I would think about this is, so I want cards that are going to be the most useful to both strategies. It's going to be able to pick up slack when we are behind or when we're just trying to get our plan together. And we definitely do want to have fewer cards that stress out our game plan or our deck. I'll also say there's definitely some cards we just don't want in the deck, period. But looking at that, I do like always focusing on higher mana cards, because if they aren't pulling their weight, it really sucks. Because, you know, it's one thing for a card that's like an early game, you know, Ruin Crab costs only 1 mana, it can do a lot, but if you get it at the wrong time, or if it's not going to work out, you've only, like, if you play this and it gets removed, you've only invested in 1 mana in it. So the bar it has to clear to be good in the deck is actually pretty low. On the other hand, True Conviction is having a much harder time. Don't get me wrong, I do like that we have a very large collection of creatures. That's not the problem. The problem is that almost universally, our creatures are very low on power, and for them to grow in power requires a certain level of investment or synergy to get it there. Not even including that some of our best creatures like Drogskull Reaver actually get no benefit at all from True Conviction, which is actually kind of funny. So to me, True Conviction sticks out as a card that I generally don't like in most decks, to be honest, but here especially feels particularly weak. When some of our best cards like Bruvok, right, actually get almost no benefit from True Conviction, it really makes me wonder why would we be casting it in the first place. And to that I say, cut. Very, very easy, very, very quick, just toss it right out of it. Going through artifacts, the main one is Marina Vendrell's Grimoire. Very, very cool card. This is functionally a card giving blue access to an ability that black tends to have. Flavorfully really cool. However, very notably has a strong weakness to it. And that is because you still lose the game for decking it. And generally, I don't think that's much of a problem, right? I think that's acceptable. And times you might be like, well, Curse, they're universally, you know, if you're saying that if you draw 80 cards, you lose the game. And if you've drawn 80 cards and you haven't won the game, homie, you've lost the game, which I do tend to agree with. However, this deck threatens very, very quickly to be gaining upwards of 20, 30 life in turn. And this card that functionally works as a fog effect with a massive life, like a draw engine attached to it, is really, really threatening you in a few turns to deck you out, because just of the nature of the deck. Once again, you might be like, well, Cursed, don't you play Necromode? Don't you play other such cards that threaten to draw an immense amount of cards with a downside of potentially losing the game? Obviously, Necro works a little different, but it's the example I thought. So here, obviously, my point would be very succinctly, this is double the mana. This is double the mana. It is an artifact, which makes it uniquely vulnerable in a way enchantments are not. And it's double the mana. It's really hard to get past that. It's a really, really neat card, but without the ability to cheat this out very quickly, without the ability to kind of maybe temper how much of our deck we will draw. Like, we don't have ways to shuffle our cards back in. We don't have something to do with discarding a bunch of cards. I'm thinking like Mind Over Matter and that kind of stuff. Without these kind of cards, we're really putting ourselves in a situation where we had to tap out from Marina's Grimoire. We draw 5 cards. We now have reduced our life total to probably around, let's say 10, reasonably. Then we're hoping that by attacking or by other triggered abilities, we're going to gain, let's say 10, 15. That's going to translate into 10, 15 cards. Our life total is now 30. So, you know, the more I talk about the more I dislike this card, but fundamentally what I'm saying is your life total went down from what I think would be a safe 60, 70 in a Lifegain deck to like 30. And in the process of your opponents attacking you to reduce that life, they are forcing you to discard cards, which is a stressor. Even if you have 25 cards to discard out of your 30, it's still meaningful, right? It still ends up creating a pressure situation where you've just made the game a lot harder to win on yourself really, really quickly. So I think not only don't play this, but like keep this away from me. I think like in a dedicated discard, self-discard deck, blue-black maybe, this can do some cool things, especially reanimating it or something else that blue and black would be good at to cheat it into play. I think that's really cool, but as it is right now, profoundly upsetting. So easy toss. Looking at our instance, I'm generally fine. Obviously, Sanguine Sacrament stands out as probably being the weakest one. Reasonably, I have to ask, what do you think you're casting this for? And this is a question I think I would ask of most X spells, but this especially. If I see this card, because remember, getting twice X life is not affecting the board state. Ideally, it is knocking opponents out, but until it does, right, remember, if this mills every card but the last card in your opponent's decks, you still probably lose the game on the crackback, like, or you haven't done enough with this. And even if that's gaining you hundreds of life, it just doesn't mean you necessarily win the game. And so what is X going to be? Is X going to be 10? I don't think so. Reasonably, I don't imagine you have 12 mana often, and 12 mana at instant speed as well, because, you know, one of the things about instant spells is you get to hold up mana for them while casting out sorceries. So you've invested your entire turn to gain 20 life. That's fine. You have to cast it on your turn to get the full benefits. I should have said so. This being an instant is even worse. All of a sudden, we're in a situation where I think this is just profoundly bad. Very easy to say, just don't ever play this. Whereas at least Helioid's Intervention has this first text, which I would argue is way more important than... Obviously, this card is just profoundly better. The only downside is that this targets, whereas Sanguine Sacrament does not target, so there's like mischief and effects like that. But still, this is just better. Don't play them. Looking at our sorceries, I think this is about the time that I think it is worth talking about the idea of, well, which mill cards are worth playing and which mill cards are not. And I think it's really easy to look at something like Traumatize and say, don't play this one. This one especially is, if you haven't played with having effects before, having effects get worse and worse as the game goes on, right? When your opponent has, let's say, magically 100 cards in their deck, Traumatize milling 50 is very, very impressive. However, when your opponent has 22 cards in their deck, Traumatize milling 11 is actually pretty bad. You would have preferred a lot of other cards, and it just doesn't do enough, right? Like, it's 5 mana for this effect. A mill 11, I would pay 2 or 3 mana for. Probably 3, realistically, but I'd like to pay 2. So we're paying maybe more than double than what we'd like to. But all of this is secondary to the fact that it targets a player as opposed to each of your opponents, which a lot of other cards are just way better at. Tasha's Hideous Laughter, I'm pretty sure it's not here, but it is each opponent and would just do the job a lot better, right? Granted, whether that card is as good in Commander as it is in 60 card formats is something else, but I did want to point out what makes Traumatize a particularly weak card. It's just too much work for what it does. Comparing it very easily to Madden and Cacophony, like, it's no context, right? No contest. Obviously, the kicker mode that does each opponent is a mana more expensive, but I'm sure you don't need a mathematician to explain to you that when you multiply a card by 3 for 1 extra mana, you're generally very happy. Yes, I think most of the time you are casting this for 2, because unless you've done no milling by the time you hit 6 mana and you have nothing else to play, you generally won't be kicking. Okay, looking at, White Sun's Twilight. This is a hard card. I'm not gonna say take it out. This is a hard card. I would like to hear back. People play this card, let me know. I'd like to hear the opinion. This is like, I can see this being like the best deck for White Sun's Twilight because you get so much out of this. You get an alternative win con, you get to destroy, get a board clear, you get to gain the life that makes your deck work. Albeit you need to bring back your commander if you destroy all the creatures. Still, there's a lot of synergy, and I'm still looking at this card being like, yeah, I don't think I would ever cast this card. Like, it just feels like such an investment in a deck that struggles to invest, giving you something that can block if you can't hit that X being 5 or higher. Basically, it's not even a fog, which is particularly bad. So all over this, this feels like post board clear, you're really into that. But even then, I feel like there's better X cards for milling in blue that I'd like every single time. I will say I do like it's an alternative win con, but I don't know to what essence I would just say play White Sun Zenith instead. Creating a bunch of tokens already has a bunch of synergy with some of the strongest creatures that we have, so I don't really see why we couldn't just do that. Alright, let's finish up with creatures. Once again, we're just looking at a bunch of the higher CMC cards, namely Terizian Mindbreaker. Ain't looking too cute. I think this is Traumatize, but almost worse, because at least Traumatize, you can pick the player you can't attack, whereas this, you need to either play 7 and get it attack multiple times for it to be worth it, or this has to be in your graveyard and you have to unearth for 4 with 3 blue in a deck that's mostly 1. All of this seems like a really tall order, and the payoff just does not feel good. I just fundamentally don't think it's good. Perhaps there's a universe that this does a lot of work in a multiple combat kind of thing, copying triggers, copying everything else. And I do recognize, I want to be clear, I've kind of gone over this, and because there is a synergy in milling half of your deck when you have milling half of someone's deck. When you have Bruvak, right, when they end up milling their entire deck in one go. My goodness. So, let me tell you, if Bruvak's out and you say mill half of your deck, they mill their whole deck, I think. But I'm going to objectively say that if Bruvak is out, you don't need these mill half decks. Like, I think you're good. I think you can win the game from there. I think the amount of milling you're going to do is already very easily going to reach, like easily 50 cards, right? And if 50 cards doesn't mill out all of your opponent's cards, I think that's, you gotta do, it's fine, right? I guess let me word it like this. I'm sorry, I'm having a hard time getting the thoughts together. Here's the thought. If you have Bruvak out, and you have the means to tap out for 5 or 6 mana, to mill your opponents, to mill them out completely, I think you're probably in a situation where either you have to protect Bruvak because your opponents are going to interact, or if you cast a bunch of other spells leading up to you gaining enough life to mill out your opponents, it's very, very doable. right? The reason I say this is in order to do the thing I'm explaining, you need 8 to 9 mana minimum. More if you want protection spells, which I really do think you do. You do absolutely want counterspell and other things up to protect what you're doing, because you're really going all in on your strongest creature not dying mid-turn, right? And yeah, that does happen, don't get me wrong. But if that's happening all the time, maybe you got to have a different power level expectation, let's say. But at the moment, all this to say, I get the synergy with Bruvac, but even then, like, let's look at this scenario again. You gotta have Bruvac out, which means you either need 3 mana or you need your opponents to have not interacted with Bruvac, probably the most terrifying card in your deck, in order to get further. Does Water Crystal do the same thing? Yeah, no, Water Crystal does not do the same thing. So Bruvac is out, your opponents aren't interacting with it. Then you need to play the Mindbreaker. Ideally, you unearth it, it gets haste, you attack, and you knock out one player, right? Let's remember that, one player. Or you play the Mindbreaker. Do we have Lightning Greaves? I guess we put on Lightning Greaves and we attack. And then when we attack, we mill out one player. Or worst case scenario, we play Bruvac, we play the Mindbreaker, we wait a turn cycle, our opponents look at each other and go, why even try to stop you? And then you take them out one at a time. I just don't think it's reasonable. I think they're very easy cuts. All these double, like, mill half the decks, and you're going to be pretty happy. Likewise, I feel like Mirelurk Queen is like 1 mana too much for what it does. There's a version of this I'm going to suggest that triggers off of Lifegain. You'll see it in the additions, and it's 1 mana less. I know we have quite a big slot in the 4-drops, but I do still prefer that over this 5 mana card. It does, like, honestly, because partially I want to take out more mill cards. I would like to keep more Lifegain cards because I think they just do more. And like milling half your opponent's deck and then not being able to mill any more of that is way less good than like gaining double your health and having to wait to gain more. You know what I mean? I'm trying to word it in a way. Like, the thing is gaining a bunch of life will keep you alive and will keep you playing the game. Whereas milling half your opponents, half their decks, all of a sudden, you know, a lot of their cards have turned on, their reanimation works, a bunch of threshold cards works, a bunch of Ewit cards work. Like, there's a lot of things that you've basically helped them do, and then until you mill the other half of their decks, that first half has not done anything for you. So if given the option, drop as much of the mill and like invest in the Lifegain. And so with that in mind, with this idea of having a card like this, that was a lot of phrases that didn't make sense. With that in mind, I don't think the Mirelurk Queen is doing enough for us. I think it is encouraging us to play the weaker half of our deck instead of the stronger half, which is just potentially not very strong. This is not even including that this is a blink creature in a non-blink deck, and 2 rat counters is so deeply meaningless that I think your opponents will never even. Okay, looking quickly at the rest, Basilica Guards feels like a mistake. I don't even know how to talk about it. Syndic of Thides as well. I understand they're here for the actually quite strong ability of Extort. However, I think it is just more reasonable to hope for the Blind Obedience or otherwise find ways to dig for. Do not play these really bad cards when we are at 11 cards over our deck limit. They just are not doing enough. Okay, I have covered a lot here. Let's go into our additions of what I'm suggesting. So I think this deck was just submitted pre Edge of Eternities, but obviously Space-Time Anomaly is a really, really good addition. This is a really, really fun card. I really like it. I do recognize to an extent that this is not each opponent. You get that. However, I think this does the thing that solves. This is the type of card that I prefer the deck to go in a direction. The one that the payoff is the life you've gained and not the mill you've done. Because if you have Traumatize, for example, Traumatize only benefits you if you have milled your opponent enough. Traumatize, good. And the funny thing is the more you've milled them, the weaker Traumatize is. Already double nombo there. It does nothing with life gain and actually gets kind of worse the more. Space-Time Anomaly is the exact opposite and is probably the best card to add in this deck, right? Because if you've been working on your life gain, which I should have, and you have 80 life, well, Space-Time Anomaly is pretty happy to mill your 80 cards. On the opposite direction, if you were to have been milling the whole game and your life total isn't as good, and let's say is in the 20s, well, it doesn't matter because milling someone 20 cards might still knock them out. So in both scenarios, you're very happy to see this card. I would say to the point that I could imagine a version of this deck where you are playing blue cards that will return instants and sorceries from your graveyard to your hand, and your goal is to cast this spell several times, because it is just that good. I leave that up to the deck builder to decide, but it is fundamentally the best card to add, bar none. Just a cute one I wanted to adjust. I know tutors were trying to keep this at bracket 3, and tutors do start to push on that, but Starfield Shepherd is very, very good in this kind of deck, very specifically because it'll grab his planes, that's cool, but it will grab our Soul Sisters. For those who don't know, Guide of Souls, Soul's Attendant, and Soul Warden are all one mana creatures that will say whenever a creature enters play, you gain life. Obviously, Guide of Souls is a little weaker, quote-unquote weaker, because it's only your creatures, but the other two are immensely powerful because if you have a token player or otherwise just your opponents are doing things, you are going to be gaining bonus life. Now, that bonus life does not trigger our commander because it's our turn, but life is life, right? With that in mind, having a 2-mana card that tutors for a 1-drop in white, which has some of the best 1-drops, is very, very powerful. I play this in Brina. I play this in any white deck that has the, the interest in tutoring, which at the power level I play in is all of them. So I would be amiss to not encourage you to play this. I alluded to this earlier, like the Murloc or whatever it was, Murdoch, whatever the weird crab guy was. Exemplar of Light just does the job better. Whenever you gain life, get a +1/+1 counter on this creature, and whenever you put 1 or more +1/+1 counters, draw a card. This is only once per turn. So this is nice because fundamentally it solves the problem I had just mentioned where gaining life on your opponent's turns doesn't do as much. Well, now you have a payoff, and that's really nice. In addition, not only is this a really good draw engine in a deck like this, it itself is just representing a very, very big threat that comes really, really quickly. Don't get me wrong, obviously some of the doubling, like the ones that say double your life total, Beacon of Immortality, is pretty bad with this card, but a lot of your smaller ones, a lot of the Soul Sisters, they work really, really well with this. If you can reasonably have this into a 12/12 in a turn cycle or two, your opponents have something to deal with that distracts them while you go. This is one of the few cards that makes me think, yeah, I would love for this to have life gain, and it might be worth finding a way to give it the Shadow Spear or otherwise, whereas for most other creatures, I don't particularly care. Dazzling Angel, this is just another Soul Sister, obviously just not as good as the others because it costs 3 times as much for the addition of 1 power, 2 toughness, and flying. However, I do fundamentally believe that it is still absolutely worth it. I think every Soul Sister style effect is just going to make such a big difference in your deck that you want redundancy. If you've seen me play Aristocrat decks, it's the same mentality. The redundancy is key. More and more cards that do the same thing allow you to build into the same game plan rather quickly and be rewarded for it. So yes, overcosted, but still, I think very, very good. I had alluded to a fog a while ago, but here is Riot Control. Riot Control does a lot for this deck. Obviously, the fog effect that stops damage coming at you can be really, really meaningful because despite the fact you have quite a bit of life, you do still lose to combat damage. Does that look like? That looks like infinite attackers, where someone can use like Splinter Twin to create, say, 3,000 creatures and attack with you, things like that. And though we have propaganda style effects, it doesn't hurt in order to still prevent that damage. This also stops, however, things like infect, which is a big weakness that like decks can't really deal with. This also stops triggers when you take damage, things like that. It can be very mean. It also can mess up plans. I've done this, I'm sure others have, where your opponents collude together to work one attack after another to knock you out. If you can fog one of those, it blows out all of the effort of the first two or the other two players. Therefore, that's very valuable. But all of that is flavor text. This line of text here that says you gain 1 life for each creature your opponents control. This is fundamentally such a powerful effect. I think, in essence, if you were to play this, as I said before, as a combo deck, right? And I'm not saying that's what we're doing, I'm just saying, imagine with me. You have, what, 7 mana? I think 7 is the number I'm looking for. No, it's 6 mana, right? Yeah. You have 6 mana. You untap, you cast Silence. If Silence resolves, your opponents have nothing to do. You pay 2 mana and you cast your commander. Then you cast Riot Control. If your opponents have collectively enough creatures, which in a lot of boards they do. I've played games very reasonably, very recently. Very recently, so it's very reasonable that this happens. I played against opponents that have upwards to 20 to 30 creatures. And on those boards, my other opponents also had 5 to 8 too. So this is, I think, pretty reasonably a mill half your deck for each opponent. And that might not one-shot them, but it can be a part of one-shot. Because if you have those static life gain doublers, if you have that mill doubler, all of a sudden Riot Control becomes really, really strong. So this is just a really powerful card and a very, very easy to ask me. This card, coming near the end, this card kind of represents multiple cards, but Surge of Salvation is here as protection. And so this can be, I think Emerging Light is one of them, but there's a number of 1 white mana, give target creature protection, give target creature indestructible, anything like that that will keep your commander alive through targeted removal, board clears, and things like that. I really do think it is worth playing 1 to 2. They're very powerful, you're very reliant on your commander, and much like counter magic, if you are spending 1 mana to protect, for example with Surge, your entire board, and your opponent has spent 5 or 6 mana trying to use targeted removal or trying to wipe the board or something like that. Like imagine if someone played Blasphemous Act and you just surge your way through it, right? It is going to be so powerful and allow you to gain that tempo win. And with that tempo, you should be able to get I don't know necessarily like a big attack in, because that's not what this deck wants to do, but a great advantage that lets you get there. This also, once again, is way more important if you're playing a more combo-oriented version of this deck, but still, I think it is essential. Emerge Unscathed is the card I was thinking. I think this is the last card. I just wanted to mention something like Psychic Corrosion. I do think if you were to go more into Life Gain, cards like Psychic Corrosion get a lot better, because fundamentally Life Gain as a strategy does have some very decent card draw. It is triggered card draw, don't get me wrong, but it is still real card draw. And I do like the ability of using a card like this to take advantage of incidental gains you get through the game. Remember, every turn you get a draw, so you're milling your opponents to every single turn. This is very slow, but it is meaningful after 5 turns. Now, if you can guarantee drawing an extra card every one turn, or every few of those turns, suddenly you end up milling your opponents each like 16 cards. And 16 cards is pretty reasonable when you start thinking about all of the other incidental doing. So though it feels like this is like a pure mill card, this is the kind of mill card that I want in this deck. It's like a set it and forget it kind of. And I think that's going to do a lot for the deck. And that's pretty much all I have to say. This is, I can see with 111 cards, I can see with the kind of directions we're going in, this deck is finding its identity and finding its direction. If I wasn't clear, I do think going more into the life gain strategy, replacing something like Jace's Phantasm with like Ajani Primate style cards, you know, those creatures that grow from gaining life. Like, I think that'll be much better, and you will be getting a little further with it. And then maybe thinking about how to flip those situations where you've been working hard at knocking your opponents down to immediately win the game through one big mill would be the direction to go. However, that's still dependent on how the deck builder wants to go. Otherwise, generally, I like a lot of things. I think I skipped over a lot of things that I would find a little stressful. Like, I do, these enchantments, these middle cards, especially the cards that are here 4 mana are particularly weak, but we're kind of too early in the deck construction. This card that I am floating over with my mouse, don't worry about it. But with that in mind, I do really like this deck. I think a lot of people were really into building this deck because this is such a direct commander. I think the deck would benefit from a copy of a card like this, so you're not completely, losing without your commander, but we'll have to see if that. All right, I'm gonna go rest my voice. Thank you so much for watching. Good luck. Happy deck building.
Thank you so much for watching. This video is brought to you by viewers like you and people on my Patreon. If you'd like to send me another draft of this deck, or any deck, there is a link in the video description down below. And if you'd like to make your deck one of my donation decks I work on, there's a link there too. Finally, if you'd like to like, comment, subscribe, I would be very appreciative. It helps the channel quite a bit. Thank you and good luck in brewing and building.